The carriage door swung open before the wheels had even stopped moving, and Elena Voss stepped down into a courtyard full of eyes that did not want her there. Cold wind cut across the stone yard of Blackthorn Hall, carrying the low growl of dozens of wolves who had gathered, simply to look at the woman their king had been forced to marry. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply stood there, in a plain gray traveling dress, while every instinct in the crowd screamed that she was prey. Nobody clapped. Nobody smiled. A young guard near the gate whispered to another, not quietly enough, that the human girl looked like she would break if the wind blew any harder. Elena heard every word. She kept walking anyway, her chin level, her steps steady on the uneven stone. At the top of the entrance stairs stood Alpha King Damon Blackthorn, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes the pale gold of his bloodline, his expression unreadable. He did not step down to meet her halfway. He waited, arms crossed, watching the small human figure climb toward him, as if she were a stranger, delivering paperwork, rather than the woman about to become his wife. "You must be Elena," he said, his voice flat, more statement than greeting. "I must be," she answered, and something in her tone made a few of the nearby wolves turn their heads. It was not fear in her voice. It was not defiance either. It was simply calm, the kind of calm that did not belong to someone who had just been handed over to a kingdom of predators. Damon studied her for a moment longer than necessary, searching her face for the tremble he expected to find. He found nothing. He told himself it did not matter. This marriage was never about her. It was about peace between the human council and the wolf packs, a fragile treaty stitched together after years of conflict, and Elena Voss was simply the price the council had chosen to pay. He turned without another word and led her inside, never once slowing his pace to match hers, never once offering his arm. Inside the great hall, the walls were hung with old banners bearing the Blackthorn crest, a wolf's head circled by silver thorns. Servants lined the corridor, some curious, most simply cold. A tall woman, with sharp cheekbones and hard eyes, stood near the base of the staircase, arms folded, watching Elena with open contempt. This was Freya, Damon's younger sister, and she did not bother lowering her voice when she spoke to the wolf beside her. "They sent us a doll," Freya said. "A soft little doll with no claws and no sense, and we are supposed to call her Queen." Elena heard that too. She always heard everything. It was a skill she had built over years, listening for the words people thought were too quiet to reach her, learning more from what was said behind her back than what was said to her face. She said nothing to Freya. She simply nodded once, politely, as if she had been greeted with kindness instead of scorn, and continued walking beside Damon toward the chambers that would now be hers. That night, alone in a room, with stone walls and a single narrow window, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to breathe, not from fear, from focus. She had spent every hour since crossing into wolf territory reading the pack the way a hunter reads a forest, noting exits, counting guards, memorizing faces, watching who moved with confidence and who moved with hesitation. None of them noticed. None of them ever noticed, because they were all looking for weakness, and weakness was exactly what she had learned to show them. Elena had not always been soft-spoken and careful. Long before the council chose her name from a list of eligible brides, she had been someone else entirely, someone whose name did not appear on any official record, someone trained since childhood by people who no longer existed in the eyes of the world. But that was a story for another time, buried deep beneath the plain gray dress, and the quiet nod, and the calm, steady voice that never once cracked in front of a room full of wolves. For now, she was simply the human bride, fragile, forgettable, exactly what she needed them to believe. The next morning came fast, the way mornings in an unfamiliar place always do, pale light slipping through the narrow window before Elena had fully closed her eyes. A servant knocked twice, waited for no answer, and entered anyway, laying out a dress of deep blue fabric on the end of the bed without a word of greeting. Elena thanked her. The servant did not respond, simply turned and left, leaving the door open behind her, as if closing it politely for a human guest was too much effort to spare. Elena dressed slowly, taking her time, despite the open door, despite the sound of boots and low conversation drifting from the hallway outside. She had learned long ago that rushing only invited people to notice you, and being noticed was the last thing she wanted here. Not yet. not until she understood exactly what kind of place she had been sent into. Breakfast was served in a hall far too large for the handful of people seated at the long table. Damon sat at the head, already eating, already deep in conversation with two of his advisors about border patrols and grain shipments, matters that clearly mattered far more to him than the woman who had just become his wife. He did not look up when Elena entered. He did not gesture for her to sit beside him. A servant quietly guided her to a seat near the far end instead, close enough to hear the conversation, far enough to be excluded from it. Freya sat 2 seats down, picking at her food, glancing at Elena every so often with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and disdain. When their eyes finally met, Freya did not look away first. "Did you sleep well?" Freya asked, though her tone made it clear she did not care about the answer. "Very well," Elena said. "Thank you for asking." Freya's mouth twisted slightly, as if she had expected a different response, perhaps something closer to nervous stammering. She turned back to her food without another word, and Elena allowed herself a small, private moment of satisfaction. She had learned over many years that the fastest way to unsettle someone looking for weakness was to simply refuse to show it, calmly, politely, without ever raising your voice. After breakfast, Damon finally addressed her directly for the first time since the courtyard. "You will stay within the palace grounds," he said. "Not quite a request. The forest beyond the eastern wall is not safe for someone like you." "Someone like me," Elena repeated, tilting her head slightly. "A human," he said, as though the word explained everything that needed explaining. "Wolves patrol those woods, rogue packs, things that would not hesitate to hurt you before realizing who you are." Elena nodded slowly, filing away the information rather than arguing with it. She had no intention of following the instruction. Not fully, but there was no reason to let him know that yet. "I understand," she said instead, and Damon seemed satisfied enough to turn back to his advisors, already moving on to the next matter of his day, already forgetting she was in the room at all. It was, in its own strange way, exactly what Elena wanted. Being forgotten meant being underestimated, and being underestimated had kept her alive more times than she could count. Over the following days, Elena settled into a quiet rhythm within the palace walls. She learned the names of the servants who were kind to her, and the names of the ones who were not. She learned which hallways were watched most closely, and which were left unattended after the evening meal. She learned that Damon rarely slept before midnight, that he took his coffee black and strong, that he carried the weight of his crown the way some men carry old injuries, trying not to let it show but failing more often than he realized. She also learned that the pack did not trust her, not even slightly, and that trust was not something she could earn through kindness or patience alone. Wolves respected strength above all else, and to them, a human bride who never raised her voice, who never fought back against their insults, who simply smiled and nodded and disappeared into the background, was the very definition of weakness. Elena let them believe it. Every insult whispered just loud enough for her to hear, every sideways glance from the guards stationed near her door, every quiet laugh from servants who thought a human girl could not possibly understand what they found so amusing about her. She absorbed all of it without complaint. Not because it did not sting, it did, more than she would ever admit, but because reacting would have cost her something far more valuable than pride. It would have cost her the element of surprise. There was one evening, nearly a week into her stay, when she nearly broke that careful discipline. She had been walking back from the palace library, her arms full of old maps she had quietly borrowed under the pretense of studying the region's history, when she passed 2 guards stationed outside the eastern corridor. They did not notice her approaching in the dim torchlight, and their conversation carried easily across the stone floor. "The king should have refused the treaty," one of them muttered. "A human bride weakens us in front of every rival pack in the region. Ronan of Ashgrove will use this against us the moment he gets the chance." "She will not last a season," the other replied, laughing quietly. "Half the court already wonders if she will survive her first winter here, let alone anything worse." Elena kept walking, her pace unchanged, her expression calm, though something cold and sharp settled behind her ribs at the mention of the name Ronan. She had heard that name before, whispered among council officials back home, always with a note of caution in their voices. Ronan, Alpha King of the Ashgrove Pack, was not simply a rival ruler. He was ambition wearing a crown, a wolf who measured his own strength by how thoroughly he could dismantle the strength of others. She filed the name away, alongside everything else she had learned since arriving, and continued down the corridor as if she had heard nothing at all. That night, unable to settle her thoughts enough to sleep, Elena did something she had promised herself she would not do so soon after arriving. She waited until the palace fell silent, until the last of the evening patrols passed beneath her window, and did not return, and then she slipped out into the dark. The eastern woods stretched wide beyond the palace wall, tall and shadowed even under a clear sky, exactly the kind of place Damon had warned her to avoid. Elena moved through the trees with a quiet, practiced ease that would have surprised anyone who had watched her calm, careful steps through the palace halls. Out here, in the dark, away from watching eyes, she did not need to pretend. She found a small clearing far enough from the wall that no patrol would stumble upon it by accident, and she stood there for a long moment, simply breathing in the cold night air, letting the tension of the past week fall away from her shoulders. Then, slowly, she began to move. Her movements were not the movements of someone fragile. They were precise, controlled, the kind of motion built through years of relentless training rather than natural grace. Every strike and step aimed at an invisible opponent only she could see. She had not practiced properly since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, and her body welcomed the release of it, muscle memory taking over where careful restraint had held her still for days. She did not know that a lone guard, walking a wider patrol than usual near the edge of the wall, caught a brief glimpse of movement in the distant clearing, strange and fast, gone before he could be certain of what he had seen. He would report it the next morning, uncertain, describing only shapes and shadows, and no one in the palace would think to connect the story to the quiet, unassuming human bride who never left her chambers after dark. Elena trained until her breath came ragged, and her muscles ached in the familiar way that meant she had pushed herself exactly as far as she needed to, and then she stopped, standing still in the clearing, looking up at the distant lights of the palace through the trees. Somewhere in there, Damon Blackthorn slept without knowing the first true thing about the woman he had married. Somewhere in there, Freya dreamed of a rival she could easily dismiss. Somewhere beyond the borders of this kingdom, Ronan of Ashgrove sharpened his ambitions, unaware that the human bride he would soon underestimate was not what anyone believed her to be. Elena allowed herself one more slow breath, then turned and made her way back through the trees, careful, silent, invisible, exactly as she needed to remain for a little while longer. There would be a time to reveal herself. She knew that much with certainty. But that time was not now, and until it arrived, she would keep walking through Blackthorn Hall with her head bowed and her strength hidden, letting an entire kingdom of wolves believe they had married nothing more than a fragile, forgettable human girl. They were wrong, and when the truth finally came out, it would come out in a way none of them would ever forget. Morning came with a chill that clung to the stone corridors of Blackthorn Hall, and Elena rose before the servant arrived to announce the day. She had barely slept, her muscles still humming from the night before, but she moved through her routine with the same quiet composure she had worn since her first day in the palace. No one could know how tired she was. No one could know anything at all. Freya found her in the garden that afternoon, sitting alone near a stone fountain that had long since stopped running, its basin dry and cracked from years of neglect. Elena had chosen the spot deliberately, far enough from the main paths that few people bothered to walk there, close enough to the palace walls that she could still hear snippets of conversation drifting from the training yard beyond. "You spend a lot of time alone," Freya said, settling onto the low stone edge of the fountain, without waiting for an invitation. "Most people who come here try to make friends, allies, someone to stand beside them when the court turns cruel." "I have not found the court particularly welcoming," Elena replied evenly, folding her hands in her lap. "Can you blame us?" Freya's voice carried an edge, though something beneath it sounded almost curious rather than purely hostile. "A human bride is an insult to every wolf who has ever bled defending this pack. My brother agreed to this marriage because the council forced his hand, not because he wanted a wife who cannot even stand against a strong wind." Elena considered her words carefully before answering. She had learned, over many years, that silence often revealed more than a sharp response ever could, and she had no interest in giving Freya the satisfaction of an argument. "Perhaps," she said simply. "Or perhaps you have not yet seen what I am capable of." Freya laughed, a short, humorless sound. There is nothing to see. You eat quietly, you walk quietly. You disappear into corners like a mouse, hoping the cat forgets it exists. That is not strength, that is survival, and it will not save you here. Survival is not the weakest form of strength, Elena said. It is simply the quietest. Something flickered across Freya's face, an emotion she did not seem willing to name. And for a moment, the silence between them stretched taut and uncomfortable. Then Freya stood, brushing off her clothes as though the conversation had left some kind of residue she needed to shake away. "You will not last," she said again, echoing the words Elena had already overheard from the guards days earlier. "Not through the winter. Not through anything this pack throws at you." She walked away without waiting for a response, and Elena remained seated by the dry fountain long after Freya's footsteps faded into the distance, turning the exchange over carefully in her mind. Freya's contempt was sharp, but beneath it Elena had sensed something else entirely, something closer to worry than hatred. Whatever Freya's reasons were, they ran deeper than simple prejudice against humans, and Elena made a quiet note to find out why, before assuming she understood the whole picture. That evening, the palace prepared for a formal dinner unlike any Elena had attended since her arrival. Servants moved with brisk urgency through the halls, polishing silver, arranging flowers, setting long tables with a precision that suggested important guests were expected. Elena asked one of the kinder servants, a young woman named Clara who had shown her small courtesies over the past week, what the occasion was. "King Ronan of the Ashgrove pack arrives tonight," Clara said, lowering her voice, as though the name itself carried danger. "He comes to discuss the terms of the border treaty with our king. It is said he does not travel for small matters. Whatever he wants, it will not be simple." Elena's pulse quickened slightly at the name, though her expression did not change. She thanked Clara for the information, and returned to her chambers to prepare, her mind already working through everything she had overheard about the Ashgrove king in the days since arriving at Blackthorn Hall. Ambitious, ruthless, a wolf who measured his worth by how thoroughly he could diminish the strength of others. She would need to be careful tonight, more careful than she had been at any point since crossing into wolf territory. The great hall glowed with candlelight by the time the guests began arriving. Long tables set with more food than Elena had seen since arriving. Wolves in formal attire filling the space with low conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter that seemed forced, tense beneath its surface. Damon stood near the entrance, dressed in dark formal robes trimmed with silver, greeting arriving nobles with the practiced calm of a ruler who understood exactly how much was riding on this evening. When Ronan finally arrived, the entire hall seemed to shift, conversations quieting just slightly, attention gravitating toward the tall Wolf King, who entered with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own power. He was handsome, in a sharp, calculated way, his dark eyes moving across the room with the assessing gaze of a predator counting potential threats, and finding none worth his concern. His gaze landed on Elena for only a moment, before dismissing her entirely, sliding past her as though she were part of the furniture, rather than the king's own wife. Dinner proceeded with careful diplomatic conversation, both kings navigating the delicate terms of their border agreement, with words chosen precisely enough to avoid outright conflict, while still testing the edges of each other's patience. Elena listened closely, saying little, watching the way Ronan's advisors positioned themselves around the hall, noting exits, counting numbers, the same instinctive habits she had trained into herself long ago now visible in the movements of Ronan's own people. It was near the end of the meal, when wine had loosened tongues just enough, that Ronan finally turned his attention toward Elena directly, his tone light but his words carrying a deliberate edge. "Tell me, Damon," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "was it truly necessary to marry a human? Surely there were stronger options among your own kind, wolves capable of standing beside you rather than simply standing near you." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall, quickly stifled but not quiet enough. Damon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena saw something flash behind his pale gold eyes, something that might have been anger on her behalf, though he said nothing to defend her directly. "The treaty required it," Damon said instead, his voice measured. "Peace between our people and the human council was worth the arrangement." "Peace," Ronan repeated, tasting the word as though it amused him. "A noble goal, though I wonder how much peace is truly worth, if it comes at the cost of appearing weak in front of every rival pack watching your borders." His eyes flicked toward Elena again, briefly, dismissively. No offense intended, of course. Elena met his gaze evenly, her expression calm, betraying nothing of the sharp focus building quietly behind her composed exterior. "None taken," she said simply, and something in her steady voice seemed to catch Ronan slightly off guard, though he covered it quickly with another easy smile. "She speaks," Ronan said, turning back to Damon with a note of mock surprise. "I was beginning to wonder if the council had sent you a statue instead of a bride." The comment drew more laughter, and Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see whether she would shrink beneath the humiliation, or simply endure it, silently, as she had endured everything else since arriving. She chose neither. Instead, she offered Ronan a small, polite smile, the kind that gave away absolutely nothing. "Statues do not eat, Your Majesty," she said calmly, "and I have thoroughly enjoyed this meal. My compliments to your hosts." For a brief moment, the hall fell silent, uncertain whether to laugh or simply stare. Ronan's smile faltered just slightly before he recovered, raising his glass in an exaggerated gesture of acknowledgement, though the amusement in his eyes had shifted into something colder, more calculating. Elena had not embarrassed him outright, but she had refused to play the role he expected of her, and wolves who built their power on dominance rarely appreciated being denied that small, easy victory. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the great hall had emptied of its candlelight and noise, Damon found Elena in the quiet corridor outside her chambers. He looked at her for a long moment, an expression on his face she had not seen before, somewhere between confusion and grudging curiosity. "You surprised me tonight," he said finally. "Did I?" Elena replied, neither confirming nor denying it. Most people do not speak to Ronan that way. Even my own advisors choose their words carefully around him. "I simply answered his question," Elena said. "There was nothing remarkable about it." Damon studied her for another moment, as though trying to see past the calm surface she presented so effortlessly, searching for whatever it was that had allowed her to hold her ground against a king known throughout the region for his cutting words and cold ambition. He did not find an answer that satisfied him, and eventually he simply nodded, wishing her a quiet good night, before disappearing down the corridor toward his own chambers. Elena stood alone in the dim light for a long moment after he left, replaying the evening in her mind. Ronan's dismissal of her had been calculated, deliberate, a small test disguised as careless conversation, and she had passed it without revealing anything true about herself. But something told her this would not be the last test he set before her. Wolves like Ronan did not simply let go of a challenge once they sensed one, and the flicker of cold calculation she had seen behind his easy smile told her clearly enough that tonight had been only the beginning. She thought of Freya's words from earlier that day, the strange note of worry buried beneath her contempt, and wondered, not for the first time, exactly what kind of history existed between Blackthorn Hall and the Ashgrove Pack. What old wounds Ronan's visit might be reopening beneath the polite language of treaties and borders. Whatever it was, she suspected she would learn the truth of it soon enough, and she intended to be ready long before that truth arrived. 3 days after the dinner, Ronan had not yet left Blackthorn Hall. His advisors claimed the border negotiations required further discussion, though Elena noticed that very little actual negotiating seemed to take place during the long afternoon meetings held in the council chamber. Instead, Ronan spent his mornings walking the palace grounds with an easy, unhurried confidence, as though he owned the place already and was simply waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. Elena kept her distance from him whenever possible, though it proved difficult given how often their paths crossed within the palace walls. She found him one morning near the training yard, watching a group of young wolves spar with clear disinterest, his arms crossed, his expression bored in a way that seemed almost performative, as though he wanted witnesses to see exactly how unimpressed he was by Blackthorn's warriors. "You are up early," he said, noticing her approach before she had a chance to change direction. "I could say the same of you," Elena replied, stopping a respectful distance away, careful to keep her tone light and unremarkable. Ronan studied her for a moment, the same assessing gaze he had turned on her at dinner, though this time it lingered longer, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit the picture he expected. "You are an interesting woman," he said finally. "Most humans who find themselves surrounded by wolves either tremble constantly or overcompensate with false bravado. You do neither. It makes you difficult to read. Perhaps I simply have nothing to prove, Elena said. Everyone has something to prove, Ronan replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. Even those who claim otherwise, especially those who claim otherwise. He glanced toward the sparring wolves in the yard, then back at her. Tell me, has Damon shown you the extent of what it means to lead a pack? The responsibilities, the constant threats from rivals, who would gladly claim his territory the moment he shows the smallest weakness? He has told me enough, Elena said carefully. Has he told you that a king who cannot protect his own borders, who marries outside his kind for the sake of a fragile peace treaty, invites exactly the kind of challenge I am considering? Ronan's voice remained light, almost conversational, but the words carried unmistakable weight. The old laws still exist, you know. Ways for a rival king to test whether a throne truly deserves its crown. Elena kept her expression neutral, though inwardly, she filed away every word with careful attention. You speak as though you already have something specific in mind. I speak of possibilities, Ronan said smoothly. Nothing more, for now. He offered her a small, polite bow, the picture of courteous restraint. It was pleasant speaking with you, Elena. I imagine we will have further opportunities before my visit concludes. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Elena standing near the edge of the training yard with a cold, uneasy feeling settling in her chest. Whatever Ronan was planning, his visit to Blackthorn Hall had never truly been about a border treaty. The treaty was simply the excuse, a polite reason to walk through Damon's halls, study his defenses, and search for the exact weakness he intended to exploit. She found Damon later that afternoon in his study, a room lined with old maps and thick ledgers, papers scattered across his desk in the organized chaos of a ruler who worked far more than he rested. He looked up when she entered, mild surprise crossing his face, since she had rarely sought him out directly since her arrival. I need to speak with you about Ronan, she said, closing the door behind her. Damon set down the paper he had been reviewing, his expression shifting into something more focused. What about him? He implied there are old laws that would allow him to challenge your crown, something related to weakness within a ruling house. Elena kept her voice steady, though she watched Damon's reaction carefully. He mentioned it as though he already intends to use it. A muscle tightened along Damon's jaw, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring down at the scattered papers on his desk, as though searching for an answer buried somewhere within them. The old laws, he said finally, his voice low. Yes, they exist. Rarely invoked in recent generations, but never formally abolished. A rival king may challenge the legitimacy of a ruling house if he believes that house has grown too weak to hold its territory. It usually applies to matters of succession, disputed claims, injuries that leave a king unfit to rule. And a marriage to someone outside your kind, Elena said quietly. Would that qualify? Damon's silence answered the question before he spoke. It has never been tested that way before. But Ronan has always been skilled at bending old traditions to serve new ambitions. If he believes he can convince enough of the regional councils that my marriage represents a genuine weakness in Blackthorn leadership, he may attempt exactly that. What would such a challenge involve? A royal duel, Damon said, between representatives of each house, fought under old traditions, witnessed by neutral parties from the surrounding packs. If Ronan's chosen fighter wins, he claims the right to dispute my crown, potentially forcing a vote among the regional councils about whether Blackthorn leadership remains legitimate. Elena absorbed this information carefully, already turning it over in her mind, already considering the shape of what was coming, even before it had fully arrived. And if you refuse the challenge? Refusing would be seen as an admission of weakness, far worse than accepting and losing, Damon said grimly. No king who wishes to keep his crown can afford to refuse a formal challenge, not without losing the respect of every pack watching from the surrounding territories. He looked at her then, something complicated passing behind his pale gold eyes, an emotion Elena could not quite name. I should not have let this happen, he said quietly. I should have protected you from becoming a target the moment Ronan set foot in this hall. You did not create this situation, Elena said. Ronan did. Long before he arrived here. He would have found some other excuse if this one had not presented itself. Damon did not look entirely convinced, and Elena understood, in that moment, that whatever else existed between them, whatever distance and formality had defined their marriage since her arrival, he did carry some genuine sense of responsibility toward her, even if pride and duty made it difficult for him to express it plainly. It was not affection, not yet, but it was something. A small crack in the careful indifference he had maintained since the courtyard on her first day. "I will speak with my advisors," Damon said finally. "We will find a way to prevent this from escalating further." Elena nodded, though privately she doubted diplomacy alone would be enough to stop a king as determined as Ronan appeared to be. She left the study without revealing that particular doubt, returning to her own chambers with her mind working through possibilities long into the evening. That night, unable to settle her restless thoughts, she once again slipped out toward the eastern woods after the palace had gone quiet, moving through the dark trees with the same careful precision as before. She needed to train, needed the familiar discipline of it to steady her mind, and the clearing beyond the wall offered the only place within Blackthorn territory where she could be fully, truly herself. She did not know that this time, she was not entirely alone. A guard named Elias, newer to the night patrol than most, had drawn the unfortunate task of walking the farthest stretch of the eastern wall, a duty most experienced wolves avoided due to its distance from the main gates and its notorious boredom. He moved along the perimeter without much enthusiasm, his senses only half alert, his mind wandering toward the warm meal waiting for him once his shift ended. It was the sound that caught his attention first, faint and rhythmic, carried on the night air from somewhere beyond the wall. He paused, ears sharpening, listening more closely. It did not sound like an animal moving through the underbrush, nor did it sound like the careless wandering of a lost traveler. It sounded controlled, deliberate, almost like combat training, the kind of disciplined movement he recognized from years of his own sparring sessions. Elias crept closer to the wall's edge, peering through a gap in the stone where the old barrier had crumbled slightly over the years. In the distance, within the small clearing beyond the trees, he caught a brief glimpse of movement, fast and precise, a figure spinning and striking at the empty air, with a speed that seemed impossible for the shadowy shape he could barely make out. He blinked, uncertain of what he had seen, and by the time his eyes adjusted more fully to the darkness, the movement had stopped. The clearing appeared empty and still. He stood there for a long moment, unsettled, telling himself it had likely been nothing more than shifting shadows and an overactive imagination brought on by a long, tedious shift. Rogue wolves sometimes wandered close to Blackthorn territory, and perhaps that explained the strange sounds, though something about what he had witnessed did not match the loose, feral movement typical of a lone rogue. He reported it the next morning to his captain, careful to keep his description vague, uncertain enough of what he had actually seen to avoid sounding foolish in front of his superiors. The captain listened, nodded, and noted it as a possible rogue sighting requiring closer patrol of the eastern boundary in the coming nights. No one in the palace connected the strange report to Elena Voss, quietly returning to her chambers before dawn, her breathing steady, her expression as calm and unremarkable as it had been every single day since her arrival. Elena herself remained unaware that she had been seen at all, though she resolved, as she settled back into her bed just before sunrise, to be more careful in the nights ahead. Ronan's presence in the palace had already raised the stakes considerably, and the last thing she needed was for anyone, wolf or human, to catch even a fleeting glimpse of what she truly was, before she was ready to reveal it on her own terms. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind circling back again and again to the conversation with Damon, to the mention of a royal duel, to the cold calculation she had seen behind Ronan's polite smile in the training yard. Whatever was coming, she understood now with complete clarity that it would not remain a quiet, distant threat for long. Ronan intended to force the issue, and soon, and when that moment finally arrived, Elena knew she would need to make a choice far more difficult than anything she had faced since stepping down from that carriage on her very first day at Blackthorn Hall. She would need to decide exactly how much of herself she was willing to reveal, and to whom, and when. News of a possible rogue sighting spread quickly through the palace the next morning, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, until by midday, the servants whispered of a dangerous creature lurking just beyond the eastern wall. Elena listened to the rumors with carefully hidden amusement, saying nothing, offering no correction, letting the story grow wilder with each passing hour, if it meant no one suspected the truth. Freya found her in the library that afternoon, seated near a tall window with an old book of regional history open in her lap, though Elena had barely read a single page, her attention still fixed on the conversation with Damon from the previous day. Freya dropped into the chair across from her without invitation, a habit Elena had come to expect by now. "Have you heard about the Eastern Wall?" Freya asked, studying Elena's face for a reaction. "A patrol guard swears he saw something moving in the woods last night. Fast, strange, not like any rogue he has encountered before." "I heard something about it," Elena said mildly, turning a page she had not actually read. "You do not seem particularly concerned," Freya observed. "Should I be?" "I have not left the palace grounds." The lie came easily, smoothly, without a flicker of hesitation in her voice, and Freya studied her for a long moment before shrugging, apparently satisfied enough with the answer. "My brother has doubled the Eastern Patrol," Freya said. "Whatever is out there, he wants it found before it becomes a real problem." She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "He also told me about Ronan's threat, the old law regarding royal duels." Elena set down the book carefully, giving Freya her full attention now. "What do you think of it?" Freya's expression shifted, the usual sharpness in her eyes softening into something more complicated, something closer to old grief than present hostility. "My mother died in a duel like that," she said quietly. "Years ago, before I was old enough to understand what was happening. A rival pack challenged our family's legitimacy after my father fell ill, and she fought in his place, because tradition demanded it. She won." Freya's voice caught slightly. "But the wounds never fully healed, and she was never quite the same afterward. She died a few years later, weaker than she should have been, weaker than a warrior of her strength had any right to become." Elena remained silent, allowing Freya the space to continue if she wished, understanding now the source of the worry she had sensed beneath Freya's contempt during their earlier conversation by the dry fountain. "I do not hate you because you are human," Freya said finally, meeting Elena's eyes directly for the first time since they had met. "I hate what your presence here represents. Another duel. Another fight my family might not survive intact. All because tradition demands we prove our strength again and again, no matter how much it costs us. I did not choose this marriage any more than you chose to lose your mother," Elena said quietly. "But I understand now why my presence here troubles you so deeply. Thank you for telling me." Freya seemed almost surprised by her own honesty, as though she had not planned to reveal so much, and she stood quickly, smoothing her skirts in a gesture that seemed more about composing herself than tidying her appearance. "Do not mistake this for friendship," she said, though the edge in her voice had softened considerably. "I simply thought you deserved to understand the stakes, since it seems my brother has not fully explained them to you." She left without waiting for a response, and Elena sat alone by the window for a long while afterward, turning the conversation over in her mind. Freya's fear was not born from cruelty, but from loss, from watching a mother pay a terrible price for a tradition that demanded strength be proven through bloodshed. It reshaped, slightly, the picture Elena had been building of the Blackthorn pack, revealing layers of old wounds hidden beneath the cold formality of palace life. Later that evening, Damon summoned his council to discuss the growing threat of Ronan's challenge. Elena was not formally invited to attend, but she positioned herself near the council chamber doors, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book to the library, close enough to hear fragments of the heated discussion inside. "He cannot be allowed to invoke the old law," one advisor argued, his voice tight with frustration. "It sets a dangerous precedent. Any rival king with a grudge could challenge our legitimacy over something as trivial as a marriage." "Trivial to you, perhaps," another voice replied, colder, more measured. Elena recognized it as Damon's. "But Ronan will frame it however serves him best in front of the regional councils. We cannot simply dismiss the threat and hope it disappears." "Then we must find our own champion," the first advisor said. "Someone capable of defeating whoever Ronan sends forward, should this reach a formal duel." A heavy silence followed, and Elena could easily imagine the grim expressions filling the chamber, the weight of the coming challenge settling over every advisor present. She thought of Freya's mother, of the price paid for proving strength through combat, and something hardened quietly in her chest, a resolve she had been circling for days finally beginning to take clear shape. She did not yet know exactly how events would unfold in the days ahead, but she understood, standing quietly outside that council chamber door, that she would not simply wait to see who Damon chose to fight in his place. Whatever happened next, she intended to have a say in it, whether the wolves of Blackthorn Hall believed she was capable of one or not. She returned to her chambers before anyone noticed her lingering near the council doors, and that night, she did not train in the eastern woods. Instead, she sat awake long past midnight, reviewing everything she remembered from her years of training, preparing herself quietly for a decision she suspected she would soon need to make. Word of Freya's challenge spread through the palace before Elena even understood what was happening. She had been walking toward the dining hall for the midday meal when Clara intercepted her in the corridor, breathless, her expression caught somewhere between excitement and concern. "Freya has challenged you to a sparring match," Clara said quickly. "She announced it in the training yard not 10 minutes ago, in front of half the court. She says it will be harmless, simply a demonstration, but everyone is already gathering to watch." Elena felt a flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed away beneath her usual calm exterior. She had not expected Freya, of all people, to force this particular confrontation, not after the conversation they had shared in the library only days earlier. But perhaps that was exactly why Freya had chosen this moment. Perhaps the old grief Freya carried made her desperate to prove, to herself as much as anyone else, that this marriage would not lead her family toward another painful loss. "Thank you for telling me," Elena said, and continued walking toward the training yard rather than retreating to her chambers, as some part of Clara's expression suggested she expected. The yard was already crowded by the time Elena arrived, wolves gathering along the edges in loose clusters, murmuring among themselves with barely restrained anticipation. Freya stood near the center of the sparring circle, dressed in simple training clothes, her expression sharp and determined. Damon stood near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his jaw tight with obvious displeasure, though he made no move to stop what was clearly already set in motion. "There you are," Freya called out, as Elena approached, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "I thought perhaps you would hide, rather than face a simple demonstration." "I do not hide," Elena said calmly, stepping into the circle. A ripple of interest moved through the gathered crowd, whispers rising and falling as people repositioned themselves for a better view. Elena caught fragments of the murmured conversations, most of them doubtful, a few outright mocking, wagers already being placed on how quickly the match would end. "This is meant only as a demonstration," Freya said, raising her voice for the benefit of the crowd, though her eyes remained fixed on Elena with an intensity that suggested something more personal than mere sport. "Nothing serious. I simply wish to see what kind of woman my brother has married." Elena understood, in that moment, exactly what Freya was doing. This was not truly about humiliation. Not entirely. Freya needed to see for herself whether Elena possessed even the smallest capacity for self-defense, needed some reassurance, however small, that her brother's wife would not become another casualty like their mother had been. It was a test born from fear rather than cruelty, and Elena decided, standing there in the circle with dozens of eyes watching, that she would answer it, as honestly as she dared, without revealing everything. "I understand," Elena said quietly, meeting Freya's gaze. Freya struck first, a quick, testing jab meant to gauge Elena's reflexes rather than cause real harm. Elena stepped aside smoothly, the movement so natural, so effortlessly timed, that a murmur of surprise rippled through the watching crowd. Freya's eyes narrowed slightly, and she struck again, faster this time, a proper combination meant to overwhelm an untrained opponent. Elena avoided every strike. She did not counter, did not retaliate, simply moved with a fluid, economical grace that made each of Freya's attacks fall through empty air again and again. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, confusion replacing the earlier mockery, as more and more people began to realize that what they were witnessing did not match anything they had expected from a fragile human bride. Freya pushed harder, frustration beginning to show in the tightness of her movements, her strikes growing faster and more aggressive as the sparring match continued. Still, Elena remained untouched, reading each attack a fraction of a second before it arrived, her feet shifting with a precision that seemed almost impossible for someone who had, by all appearances, never trained a day in her life. Finally, breathing hard, Freya stepped back, raising a hand to signal an end to the match. The training yard had fallen almost completely silent, dozens of wolves staring at Elena, with expressions ranging from disbelief to open unease. She had not struck a single blow, had not shown even a hint of aggression, Yet the sheer control of her movements had unsettled the crowd far more thoroughly than any display of open combat could have managed. "How?" Freya said quietly, her chest still heaving from exertion, her earlier sharpness replaced entirely by genuine astonishment. "How did you do that?" Elena considered her answer carefully before speaking, aware of the many ears listening, aware that whatever she said now would spread through the palace within hours, regardless of how carefully she chose her words. "I have spent my life learning to survive in places that were not kind to me," she said finally, which was true, though it revealed nothing specific enough to satisfy the growing curiosity in the crowd. Avoiding a blow does not require strength equal to the one throwing it. It simply requires attention. It was not a full explanation, and everyone watching seemed to sense that clearly enough, but no one pressed her further, too unsettled by what they had just witnessed to demand more answers immediately. Damon, still standing near the edge of the crowd, watched Elena with an expression she had not seen from him before, something caught between confusion and a grudging, dawning respect he did not yet seem willing to voice aloud. Freya approached her slowly once the crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves as they returned to their duties, the earlier mockery replaced now with something far more cautious. "I did not expect that," Freya admitted quietly, close enough that only Elena could hear her. "I know," Elena said simply. "Perhaps I misjudged you," Freya said, the words clearly costing her some effort to admit. "Though I suspect there is a great deal more to you than what you showed today." "Perhaps," Elena agreed, offering nothing further, and Freya, for once, did not push for more, simply nodding once before turning to leave the training yard, her earlier certainty visibly shaken. That evening, word of the sparring match had spread throughout the entire palace, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until by nightfall, half the court whispered that the human bride possessed some kind of hidden magic, or perhaps training from a secret human order few had ever heard of. Elena said nothing to confirm or deny any of the rumors, allowing the uncertainty itself to work in her favor, a fog of mystery settling around her that made everyone within the palace suddenly far more cautious about underestimating her openly. Ronan heard the news as well, delivered to him by one of his own advisors who had witnessed the match firsthand, and though he said little in response, something in his expression shifted subtly, a flicker of genuine reassessment replacing his earlier dismissive confidence. Whatever plans he had been quietly assembling regarding his challenge to Damon's crown, the sparring match in the training yard had complicated them in ways he had not anticipated. Elena, unaware of exactly how much attention her small demonstration had drawn beyond the palace walls, spent that night in quiet reflection, aware that the careful anonymity she had maintained since her arrival was beginning to crack, piece by piece, faster than she had originally planned. Whatever came next, she understood now with growing certainty, would arrive far sooner than she had hoped. Ronan requested a private audience with Damon 2 days after the sparring match, and this time he did not bother with polite pretense about border treaties or diplomatic courtesy. He arrived in the council chamber with 2 of his most trusted advisors flanking him, his expression carrying none of the easy amusement he had displayed at dinner nights earlier. Elena, once again positioned near enough to the chamber to hear fragments of the conversation, listened carefully as Ronan laid out his intentions with cold, deliberate clarity. "I have decided to formally challenge the legitimacy of your crown," Ronan said, his voice carrying clearly through the heavy wooden door. "Your marriage to a human bride represents exactly the kind of weakness the old laws were designed to address. A ruling house that binds itself to those who cannot fight, cannot lead, cannot stand as equals among wolves, invites question about its fitness to hold territory. The old laws are meant for matters of succession and injury," Damon replied, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Not personal opinions about the nature of a marriage. The old laws are whatever the regional councils decide to interpret them as," Ronan said smoothly, "and I believe, once I present my case, a majority of the councils will agree that your judgment in this matter reflects poorly on Blackthorn's continued strength." A tense silence followed, and Elena could easily imagine the grim expressions filling the chamber on the other side of the door. When Damon finally spoke again, his voice had lowered into something colder, more controlled. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A royal duel," Ronan said, "under the old traditions. You may choose any representative you wish to fight in your place, as is your right. and I will do the same. Should my champion win, I will bring the matter before the regional councils, and we shall see whether they agree that Blackthorn's leadership requires closer scrutiny. And if my champion wins? Then the matter ends here, Ronan said, though something in his tone suggested he did not consider that outcome particularly likely. I withdraw my challenge, and the treaty between our packs continues without further complication. Another long silence stretched through the chamber, before Damon finally responded. I will consider your proposal, and give you my answer within 3 days. Take whatever time you need, Ronan said, and Elena could hear the faint edge of satisfaction beneath his measured words, the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, regardless of how long Damon took to formally accept. I look forward to your response, Alpha King. Elena moved away from the chamber door quickly, before the meeting concluded, and she risked being discovered listening, her mind already working through the implications of what she had just heard. A royal duel, a formal challenge that could strip Damon of his crown, that could unravel the fragile treaty between humans and wolves that had brought her here in the first place, that could end, quite possibly, in genuine harm to whoever Damon chose to fight in his place. She thought immediately of Freya's mother, of the price paid for proving strength through tradition, and something in her resolved even further, hardening into a decision she had been circling for days without quite allowing herself to fully commit to it. She found Damon later that evening, alone in his study once again, the same scattered papers covering his desk, though this time his expression carried a weariness she had not seen from him before, the weight of the coming challenge visibly pressing down on him. I know about Ronan's proposal, she said, closing the door behind her. Damon looked up, unsurprised, as though he had expected her to find out one way or another. Then you know the position we are in. Who will you choose to fight in your place? Elena asked. Damon rubbed a hand across his face, clearly having wrestled with this exact question since the moment Ronan left the chamber. My best warriors are strong, but Ronan will not send an ordinary champion. He will send someone specifically chosen to guarantee victory, likely one of his most feared fighters, someone with a reputation built on defeating exactly the kind of opponents I could reasonably field. He shook his head slowly. I do not yet have a satisfactory answer. Elena stood quietly for a long moment, weighing the words she was about to say, understanding that once she spoke them aloud, there would be no taking them back. Choose me, she said finally. Damon's head snapped up, disbelief written plainly across his face. Elena, you saw what happened in the training yard, she continued, before he could dismiss the idea outright. That was a fraction of what I am capable of. I did not come to this marriage as helpless as everyone here believes. Even if that is true, Damon said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear, though she suspected it was fear for her rather than fear of losing. Ronan will send a trained warrior, someone with decades of combat experience. This is not a sparring match in a training yard, with rules everyone silently agreed to respect. This is real. I understand exactly what it is, Elena said calmly, and I am telling you, with complete certainty, that I can win. Damon studied her face for a long moment, searching for some sign of doubt or hesitation, finding none. Whatever calculation moved behind his pale gold eyes, he did not immediately refuse her outright, though his expression remained deeply troubled. Why would you offer this? He asked finally. This marriage was never something you chose freely. You owe this pack nothing, least of all your safety. Elena considered her answer carefully. Because I understand what is truly at stake here, better than most people in this palace realize. This is not simply about your crown, or Ronan's ambition. If this treaty collapses, the peace between humans and wolves collapses with it, and countless people on both sides will pay the price for a conflict neither side can afford to reignite. She met his eyes steadily. I have the ability to prevent that. I intend to use it. Damon remained silent for a long moment, and Elena watched something shift slowly behind his expression, doubt and disbelief giving way, gradually, to something more complicated, a reluctant reconsideration of everything he thought he understood about the woman standing before him. I cannot simply agree to this without understanding more, he said finally. If I am to send you into a formal duel against whatever champion Ronan chooses, I need to know exactly what you are capable of, and where this ability came from. Elena took a slow breath, understanding that the moment she had been quietly avoiding since her arrival at Blackthorn Hall had finally arrived. There was no more room left for careful evasion, no more corners to hide the truth within. "Then sit down," she said quietly. "Because what I am about to tell you, I have not told anyone in this kingdom, and very few people beyond it." Damon lowered himself slowly into his chair, his full attention fixed on her, and Elena began, for the first time since crossing into wolf territory, to tell the truth. "I was not raised the way most human children are raised," Elena began, choosing her words with the same careful precision she used for everything else, though her voice carried a weight it had not held before. "My parents died when I was very young, and I was taken in by a group that called themselves the Order of the Silent Path, a name that meant nothing to most people outside its ranks, but carried significant history among those who understood the old conflicts between humans and wolves." Damon leaned forward slightly, listening closely, though he said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "Long before the current treaty between our peoples existed, there were wars," Elena continued. "Terrible ones, fought over territory and fear and misunderstanding on both sides. Rogue wolves attacked human settlements without mercy, and in response, groups of humans formed to fight back, to protect the villages that had no other defense against creatures far stronger and faster than themselves. The Order of the Silent Path was one of these groups, though by the time I was born into their care, most of the world had already moved past open conflict and toward uneasy peace. I have heard old stories of such groups," Damon said quietly. "I did not think any still existed." "Officially, they do not," Elena said. "The order dissolved formally, many years ago, once the treaties were signed and open war between our peoples ended. But some of its members never fully let go of what they had built, the knowledge passed down through generations about how to fight against an opponent stronger and faster than any ordinary human. They continued training in secret, preserving their methods, waiting for a time they believed might come again, when that knowledge would be needed. And you were trained among them." "From the time I could walk," Elena said. "They taught me to read a wolf's body before it moved, to recognize the subtle shift in weight and stance that comes half a second before a strike, to use speed and precision, rather than raw strength, to overcome an opponent who would otherwise overpower me completely. It was not simply combat training, it was a way of seeing the world, of understanding exactly how to survive against creatures who could kill me with a single blow if I ever allowed myself to be caught off guard." Damon studied her in silence for a long moment, clearly reassessing everything he thought he understood about the quiet, unassuming woman who had walked into his palace weeks earlier. "Why did you never tell anyone this? Why hide it so completely? Even from me?" "Because the moment people learn what I am capable of, they stop seeing me and start seeing a weapon," Elena said. "The council that arranged this marriage knew nothing of my training. They selected me because my family history made me eligible under the treaty terms, not because they understood what I was truly capable of. I chose to let them believe I was simply an ordinary human bride, because it allowed me to observe, to understand the situation I was walking into, without becoming a target before I even understood who or what I needed to be wary of. And now you believe that time has come." "Ronan's challenge changes everything," Elena said. "If I remain hidden, someone else will fight in your place, someone who may not survive against whatever champion Ronan sends. I cannot allow that, not when I have the ability to prevent it." She held his gaze steadily. "I did not marry into your kingdom to hide in corners while others bleed on my behalf." Damon rose from his chair slowly, moving toward the window that overlooked the darkened training yard below, his back to her for a long moment, as he processed everything she had revealed. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression carried a complicated mixture of respect, concern, and something else Elena could not quite name, something that had not existed between them until this moment. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "you understand that Ronan will not simply accept an easy victory. He will send his most dangerous fighter, someone chosen specifically to guarantee that this challenge ends decisively in his favor. There will be no room for hesitation, no margin for error." "I understand that completely," Elena said. "And if something happens to you," Damon continued, his voice lower now, carrying a note of genuine worry that surprised her, "I would carry that weight for the rest of my life, knowing I allowed my wife to fight a battle that should never have fallen to her in the first place." Elena stepped closer, meeting his eyes directly. Then trust that I would not offer this if I believed I could lose. I have spent my entire life preparing for exactly this kind of challenge, even if I never expected it to arrive under these particular circumstances. Let me do what I was trained to do. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with everything neither of them had said aloud since the moment Elena arrived at Blackthorn Hall. The careful distance they had maintained, the assumptions each had made about the other, all of it shifting now beneath the weight of this new understanding. Finally, Damon nodded slowly, a decision settling behind his pale gold eyes. I will name you as my champion, he said quietly. But know this, whatever happens in that duel, I will be standing beside you through every moment of it, not simply as your king, but as someone who finally understands exactly what kind of woman he married. Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his words, an unfamiliar warmth she had not expected to feel within these cold stone walls. Thank you, she said simply, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, the distance between them felt just slightly smaller than before. 3 days later, when Ronan returned to the council chamber expecting Damon's formal response, he received an answer that would set the entire course of events in motion far faster than he had anticipated. The council chamber was full when Ronan arrived to receive his answer. Every advisor and senior warrior of Blackthorn Hall gathered along the walls, aware that whatever decision Damon announced today would shape the future of their kingdom for years to come. Ronan entered with his usual easy confidence, flanked by his advisors, clearly expecting nothing more than a formality before the details of the duel could be finalized in his favor. I have made my decision, Damon announced, standing at the head of the chamber with Elena beside him, dressed simply, but standing with a quiet composure that drew curious glances from everyone present. I accept your challenge, Ronan. The duel will proceed under the old traditions, as you proposed. Excellent, Ronan said, satisfaction evident in his voice. And who will represent Blackthorn Hall? Damon placed a hand lightly on Elena's shoulder, a gesture of quiet support rather than ownership. My wife, Elena Voss, will fight as my champion. The chamber erupted into stunned murmuring, disbelief and confusion spreading rapidly through the assembled wolves. Ronan's easy confidence flickered for just a moment, genuine surprise crossing his features, before he masked it beneath a slow, condescending smile. You intend to send your human bride to fight in your place? He asked, incredulity clear beneath his controlled tone. Against a champion of my choosing? I do, Damon said simply, refusing to elaborate further, refusing to give Ronan any additional information that might help him prepare more carefully for whatever Elena truly represented. Ronan studied Elena for a long moment, clearly recalling the strange sparring match rumors that had reached his ears days earlier, recalibrating whatever assumptions he had built about her since their first meeting at dinner. Whatever doubt flickered behind his eyes, he covered it quickly, unwilling to show weakness in front of his own advisors. Very well, he said finally. If that is your choice, I will honor it. The duel will take place in 3 days' time, on neutral ground between our territories, witnessed by representatives from every regional council within the surrounding lands. Agreed, Damon said. Ronan's gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer, something calculating and cold settling behind his expression, before he turned and left the chamber with his advisors trailing behind him, the earlier confidence in his stride noticeably less certain than when he had entered. Once the chamber had cleared, Freya approached Elena and Damon slowly, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of worry and cautious hope. You truly intend to fight, she said quietly to Elena, not quite a question. I do, Elena said. Freya was silent for a long moment, memories of her mother clearly resurfacing behind her guarded eyes. I watched my mother prepare for a duel much like this one, many years ago, she said finally. I remember how calm she seemed in the days beforehand, how certain she was that she would win. Her voice caught slightly. She did win, but it cost her more than any of us realized at the time. I understand the risk, Elena said gently, but I am not entering this duel unprepared, and I do not intend to let it cost me what it cost your mother. Freya studied her for a long moment, and something in Elena's steady certainty seemed to ease some small portion of her fear, though worry clearly remained etched into her features. Then I will help however I can, Freya said finally, surprising both Elena and Damon with the offer. Whatever preparations you need, whatever support I can provide, it is yours." Over the following 3 days, Elena trained with an intensity she had not allowed herself to show since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, no longer needing to hide her true abilities now that Damon and Freya both understood the truth. She used the palace training yard openly, moving through complex drills that left the watching guards speechless, her precision and speed impossible to mistake for anything but years of relentless, disciplined preparation. Damon watched her train whenever his duties allowed, his earlier doubt replaced increasingly by genuine admiration, and something warmer began to grow quietly between them during those 3 days, forged through shared purpose and mutual respect, rather than the cold formality that had defined their marriage until now. He brought her water during breaks, discussed strategy with her in the evenings, and slowly, carefully, began to see her not as an obligation forced upon him by treaty, but as a partner whose strength matched, and perhaps exceeded, his own. Elena, in turn, found herself opening up in small ways she had not expected, sharing fragments of her childhood training, the discipline and sacrifice that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Damon listened closely, asking thoughtful questions, and by the 3rd evening, as they sat together, reviewing the layout of the neutral dueling ground where the match would take place, something had shifted quietly between them, a foundation of trust neither had expected to find so quickly. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Damon said, as the sun set on their final evening of preparation, "know that I believe in you completely, not because I have to, as your husband bound by treaty, but because I have watched you these past 3 days, and seen exactly what kind of woman you truly are." "Thank you," Elena said quietly, meeting his eyes in the fading light. "That means more to me than you realize." The morning of the duel arrived clear and cold, the neutral dueling ground already filling with representatives from every regional council within the surrounding territories, all gathered to witness a confrontation that would determine far more than the fate of a single treaty. Elena stood at the edge of the field, calm and focused, Damon beside her, Freya close behind, the weight of everything resting on the coming hour, finally settling fully into place. Across the field, Ronan's champion emerged from his own camp, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd as they caught their first glimpse of exactly who Ronan had chosen to guarantee his victory. The wolf who stepped forward from Ronan's camp was enormous, easily the largest fighter Elena had seen since arriving in wolf territory, his movements carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never once lost a formal duel. His name, murmured through the crowd with a note of genuine dread, was Garrick, a champion whose reputation had been built across a dozen territories through victories that had ended, more often than not, with his opponents unable to continue. Ronan stood near his own side of the field, arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing at the corner of his mouth, as he watched Elena take her position opposite his champion. "Last chance to reconsider," he called out, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear clearly. "I would hate to see such an interesting woman come to harm over misplaced pride." Elena said nothing, simply stepping fully into the dueling circle marked out on the frost-covered grass, her expression calm and focused, betraying none of the careful calculation already running through her mind as she studied Garrick's stance, his balance, the subtle shift of weight that would telegraph his first move. A representative from the neutral council stepped forward to announce the formal rules of the duel, his voice carrying clearly across the silent field. The match would continue until one fighter yielded, was rendered unable to continue, or until a clear victory was declared by unanimous agreement among the watching council representatives. Both fighters nodded their understanding, and the representative stepped back, raising a hand before dropping it sharply to signal the beginning of the match. Garrick moved first, a powerful, direct charge meant to overwhelm his opponent immediately through sheer force. Elena did not meet the charge head-on. She stepped aside at the last possible moment, letting his momentum carry him past her, using the brief opening to land a quick, precise strike against his side as he passed. Garrick grunted, more surprised than hurt, and spun to face her again, his earlier confidence flickering slightly. The crowd murmured, uncertain what they had just witnessed, uncertain whether the fragile human bride they had heard rumors about could truly be responsible for such a controlled, effective counter. Garrick attacked again, more carefully this time, testing her defenses with a series of quick strikes rather than his earlier reckless charge. Elena moved through them with the same fluid precision she had shown against Freya in the training yard, avoiding each blow with a fraction of a second to spare, occasionally landing a light counterstrike that never fully connected with enough force to end the match, but steadily, visibly, began to wear down her opponent's composure. Minutes passed, the duel stretching longer than anyone watching had expected, Garrick's frustration mounting with every strike that failed to land, every counter that found its mark against him despite his considerable strength and experience. Ronan's satisfied smile had long since faded, replaced by a tight, controlled tension as he watched his champion struggle against an opponent everyone had dismissed as helpless only days earlier. Finally, sensing an opening, Elena shifted her strategy, no longer content to simply avoid and counter. She moved in close, faster than Garrick could track, striking a precise series of blows that targeted his balance rather than raw damage, driving him backward step by step toward the edge of the dueling circle. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, disbelief giving way to genuine astonishment, as they watched the massive wolf champion forced onto the defensive by a human woman half his size. Garrick, desperate to regain control of the match, attempted one final powerful strike, throwing his full weight behind it, in an attempt to end the duel decisively. Elena read the movement clearly, stepping into it rather than away, redirecting his momentum with a precise, controlled motion that sent him crashing to the frost-covered ground with far more force than his own attack had carried. Silence fell over the entire field. Elena stood over him, breathing steady, her expression calm despite the intensity of the match, watching as Garrick struggled to rise, his earlier confidence completely shattered. She did not press her advantage further, did not strike again while he was down. Instead, she stepped back, giving him space to yield with whatever dignity remained available to him. Garrick, breathing hard, finally raised a hand in clear signal of surrender, the traditional gesture acknowledging defeat within the old dueling customs. The neutral council representative stepped forward immediately, declaring the match concluded, Elena's victory formally recognized in front of every witness gathered on the field. The crowd remained stunned into silence for a long moment, before scattered applause began, hesitant at first, then building into something closer to genuine astonishment, as the reality of what they had just witnessed settled fully into place. Damon crossed the field quickly, relief and pride mixing openly across his features as he reached Elena's side. Ronan, however, was not finished. Fury flickered behind his controlled expression as he stepped forward himself, clearly unwilling to accept defeat delivered by a fighter he had dismissed so completely. "This proves nothing," he said sharply, loud enough for the surrounding council representatives to hear. "One duel against a single champion does not settle the question of Blackthorn's legitimacy. The terms were clearly established before this duel began," the neutral representative said firmly. "Your champion has yielded. Under the old traditions, that concludes the matter entirely." Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might press the issue further, might attempt to overturn the clear result through sheer force of will alone. But the gathered council representatives, having witnessed the duel firsthand, showed little patience for further argument, several of them already murmuring quiet agreement that the matter had been settled fairly and decisively. Finally, Ronan stepped back, his fury visibly restrained beneath a forced, tight expression of grudging acceptance. "Very well," he said coldly. "The challenge is withdrawn. The treaty stands." He turned his gaze toward Elena one final time, something complicated passing behind his eyes, respect mixed uneasily with wounded pride. "You are not what I expected, Elena Voss." "Few people expect the truth when they have already decided what they wish to believe," Elena replied evenly. Ronan said nothing further, turning instead to gather his advisors and his defeated champion, departing the neutral dueling ground with far less confidence than he had arrived with. The gathered crowd watched him go in silence, before turning their attention back to Elena, dozens of eyes now filled with something entirely different from the contempt and doubt that had followed her since her very first day at Blackthorn Hall. The journey back to Blackthorn Hall felt different from every journey Elena had made since her arrival weeks earlier. Where once wolves had watched her with suspicion and quiet contempt, they now watched with something closer to awe, murmuring among themselves as she passed, though this time the whispers carried respect rather than mockery. Damon walked beside her the entire way, closer than he had ever stood before, his hand occasionally brushing against hers, as though he could not quite believe she was truly there, truly unharmed, truly the woman who had just changed the course of his kingdom's future. That evening, Damon called the entire court together in the great hall, the same space where Elena had endured Ronan's dismissive mockery only weeks earlier. This time, as she entered the hall beside him, every wolf present rose to their feet, a gesture of respect she had not received once since crossing into Blackthorn territory. "Many of you doubted my choice when I married Elena Voss," Damon said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Some of you believed this marriage represented weakness, a burden forced upon our kingdom by treaty rather than genuine strength." He paused, turning to look at Elena directly, something warm and unmistakable in his expression. "You were wrong. Every one of you, myself included, underestimated the woman standing beside me today." A murmur of agreement moved through the hall, and Damon continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "Elena did not simply defend this kingdom today. She defended the peace between our people and the human council, a peace that countless lives depend upon. She fought not because tradition demanded it of her, but because she understood, better than most of us, exactly what was truly at stake." He reached for her hand, holding it firmly in front of the entire assembled court. "I name her not simply my wife, but my equal in every sense that matters, Luna of Blackthorn Hall, in truth as well as title." The hall erupted into genuine applause. Wolves who had once scorned her, now offering respect earned through undeniable demonstration rather than empty ceremony. Freya stepped forward from the crowd, moving to stand before Elena with an expression that carried none of the earlier hostility that had once defined their interactions. "I judged you unfairly," Freya said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I let old fear cloud my ability to see who you truly were. I am sorry for that, and I am grateful, more than words can properly express, that my brother found someone strong enough to stand beside him, rather than simply behind him." "You had good reason for your fear," Elena said gently, understanding fully now the weight of grief that had shaped Freya's earlier hostility. "I do not hold it against you." Freya offered a small, genuine smile, the first Elena had seen from her since arriving, and something settled comfortably into place between them, the foundation of what might, in time, become genuine friendship rather than cautious tolerance. In the weeks that followed, news of the duel spread far beyond Blackthorn territory, reaching every corner of the surrounding regions and eventually the human council itself, who received the reports with a mixture of relief and quiet astonishment at exactly how thoroughly their carefully arranged treaty had been protected. Ronan's pack retreated fully from any further challenge, the humiliation of Garrick's defeat serving as a clear warning against future attempts to test Blackthorn's legitimacy through similar means. Elena no longer needed to hide behind careful, unremarkable calm. She trained openly in the palace yard, sharing techniques with interested warriors who approached her with genuine curiosity rather than doubt, gradually building a place for herself within Blackthorn Hall that felt less like an obligation forced upon her, and more like a home she had genuinely earned through her own strength and choices. Her relationship with Damon deepened steadily in the months that followed, built now on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the cold formality that had defined their earliest days together. He no longer treated her as a political arrangement to be managed carefully, but as a true partner, someone whose counsel he sought genuinely, whose strength he had come to rely upon as thoroughly as his own. One evening, many months after the duel, Elena stood once again in the eastern woods, beyond the palace wall, no longer needing to sneak away under cover of darkness, no longer needing to hide the discipline that had shaped every part of who she was. Damon found her there, watching quietly from the edge of the clearing as she moved through familiar training patterns beneath the moonlight, and when she finally noticed him, she did not stop, simply beckoned him forward with a small, warm smile. "Will you teach me?" he asked, stepping into the clearing beside her. "Only if you promise not to underestimate me again," Elena said, a teasing edge in her voice that would have been unimaginable in the careful, guarded woman who had first arrived at Blackthorn Hall. "Never again," Damon promised, and meant it completely. Together, beneath the quiet stars, the Alpha King and his human bride trained side by side, no longer separated by doubt or assumption, but united by a strength that had, in the end, proven far greater than anyone within the kingdom had ever imagined possible. The wolves of Blackthorn Hall had learned, in the end, that true strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited quietly in the shadows, patient and unassuming, until the moment finally arrived to reveal exactly what it was truly capable of. And Elena Voss, once dismissed as nothing more than a fragile, forgettable human bride, had become something Blackthorn Hall would never forget.